Over the past few days, I've read and watched a ton of iPad Pro reviews that basically all say the same thing. The hardware is incredible, but the software really harms the experience. While I agreed at first, I'm no longer on board with the conventional wisdom. In fact, I think iPadOS, while not perfect, is generally on the right track. For 9 years, though, the iPad didn't even have its own operating system. It wasn't till 2019 that Apple branched iOS to create iPadOS. This was a good thing, though there's still not a massive difference between the abilities of your iPhone and iPad, while the gap between your Mac and your iPad remains vast. Let's get the obvious out of the way. For creative professionals, especially those who work across multiple applications, the iPad is hobbled. Multitasking with Stage Manager is kind of a joke compared to the freedom of desktop window management, and moving files from app to app is a lot harder than it needs to be. Memory management on the iPad is also weird, with apps and browser tabs aggressively closing, sometimes the moment you switch away from the app. While there are iOS versions of Photoshop and Illustrator, I'd never choose these over their desktop counterparts, and when I'm putting together a video that contains a mixture of clips I've filmed, stock footage, stock music and sounds, text, let's just say I'd never attempt that feat on an iPad, though it is technically possible. And here's the massive but, I think most reviewers are missing the fact that the iPad is better at certain activities than the Mac, and that's down to the iPad's differences. Aside from one major and intentional decision Apple is making in regards to the Mac, which I'll get into later, I actually think they're doing a solid job shepherding the two ecosystems. The iPad's origin is in consumption because that's how Steve Jobs introduced the device, a sheet of glass through which to view the internet, newspapers, and videos. These days, most people do still use their iPads only for these tasks, and those people certainly should not be buying this new iPad Pro. Even if you're obsessed with the idea of an OLED screen, the regular iPad screen is also very good, and you'd be saving hundreds, if not over $1,000 by getting that device instead of this one. For consumption, the iPad Pro is simply overkill. But over the years, the iPad has slowly become an excellent productivity device for certain tasks. Almost against Apple's will, developers pushed the boundary of what the iPad could do, forcing Apple to allow more advanced features to make their way onto iPadOS, like the Files app, the ability to directly transfer photos from a camera into third-party apps, and serviceable multitasking. For example, Procreate. I used to draw using a Wacom Cintiq tablet, in Photoshop, and Corel Paint on the Mac. Procreate on the iPad offers a better overall experience. From someone who learned to draw and paint using traditional media, I notice and dislike any lag or lack of realism when it comes to digital art. And when I say realism, I actually mean expectation versus result. Not does this brush look exactly like oil paint. When I move my stylus along the screen, I want the resulting line to be attached to its tip the entire way. The iPad has given me this feeling more so than any Mac, Windows, or Android machine, including Microsoft's Surface Line and Samsung's Galaxy Tab Ultra. There's other apps that thrive on the iPad as well. Adobe's Lightroom is perfect for on-the-go editing, while Scrivener's iPad version is my favorite way to write a first draft. iOS's underlying framework allows these incredibly polished experiences. Sometimes forcing developers to work within an ecosystem's limitations is a good thing. It results in specialized apps with focus, and more importantly, it has allowed new developers to make a splash with huge audiences, which is not to say that I agree with Apple's App Store policies and the reasons behind them, but that's another discussion. Anyway, my point is that the iPad is better than the Mac at some tasks, especially when those tasks don't require extensive multitasking. In fact, I think a lot of the frustration with iPadOS feeling hobbled stems from the very idea that it can be better than the Mac. There's this general feeling that if only the iPad could do everything the Mac could do, then it'd be perfect. You know, a lot of reviewers say, let's run macOS on the iPad. And the iPad is headed in that direction, but jumping right there would probably result in a worse iPad experience, just as pushing macOS too far towards the iPad would create a Windows 8 situation. There's not a really good example of a hybrid experience that satisfies both ends of the market, and I'm okay with Apple's slow and careful development here. The one place this argument falls apart for me is a decision I believe Apple has made for the growth of its bottom line, and that's their refusal to allow touchscreens on the Mac. If Macs had stylus-supported touchscreens, perhaps Apple worries it'd eat into their iPad sales, and maybe it would. Of course, they'd argue that the Mac is like a pure representation of the evolution of computers. No weird tablet hybridizations required. Adding touchscreens to existing Macs might not make sense, but introducing an additional touchscreen model would. Apple certainly isn't shy about having a ton of confusing models in their lineup these days, and I think a Mac that natively supports a stylus would be a huge hit. In the meantime, we'll have to add third-party screens to get touch on the Mac, or use the iPad itself as an extended display with Sidecar, something that actually works quite well these days, especially with the newer Apple Pencil hover feature. Apple's strategy certainly worked on me. After all, I bought the new iPad Pro, my first new iPad since the original Pro in 2018, I think. I'll tell you why it was such an easy purchasing decision, and you can decide for yourself whether or not the purchase would make sense for you. My first reason is straightforward: RAM. I tend to use a lot of layers when drawing in Procreate. Memory limitations severely controlled my canvas size and layer count to the point where I wound up making several new canvases for a single drawing. Each canvas would contain its own set of layers, and I'd copy and paste one layer set from one drawing to another after flattening it. It was a nightmare. The second reason is heat, or as Apple loves to boast, performance per watt. My 2018 iPad Pro would get so hot under intense workloads that it would continuously lower the screen brightness to prevent overheating to the point that it was too dim to use. Since the battery only lasted an hour or so under that sort of stress, I had to plug the tablet in, which of course made the heat problem even worse. As a last resort, I got a cooling pad meant for laptops, which did actually help. So far, the new iPad has handled heat a lot better, though the battery life isn't all that much more impressive. Under heavy loads with a high screen brightness, which is what I use while animating, for example, you can still drain this thing in a couple of hours. And third is the stylus, and I'm not even talking about the new Apple Pencil Pro. I almost bought a new iPad a couple years ago when Apple introduced the hover feature, something I missed terribly from Wacom's tablets. More on the Apple Pencil Pro later. Fourth is the overpriced Magic keyboard case. I do so much typing on my iPad that any improvements to the overall feel are well worth it, not to mention the function row, finally. The keys are comparable to a MacBook now, and I could easily type tens of thousands of words on this thing, a theory I'll be testing over the next few months. The trackpad is also bigger, which is nice. And that's really it. The OLED screen is excellent, but I by no means needed a better screen to be creative or productive. Once I establish a color palette, color accuracy isn't super important to me. Besides, OLEDs tend to oversaturate things, and no matter how I color calibrate my LCD to match, I find that the OLED drawings or photo edits appear muted on other displays. Though I do appreciate the deep blacks. On the other hand, I certainly don't care that the iPad is thinner. A lot of reviewers brought this up as a plus, and while the engineering is cool, I guess, there's no practical reason why I wish the tablet to be thinner than it was. You know, what I do wish though, I wish they'd kept the same thickness and added even better cooling or more battery, or just remove the camera bump. I take this thing everywhere, and it was already super portable in 2018 to the point where I never wished it was even thinner once. And then we have the new Apple Pencil Pro. Its squeeze gesture is marginally useful in that it adds another button of sorts, assuming your apps add support, and the more accurate gyroscope tilt sensitivity is genuinely cool. Again, dependent upon app support. You know what makes the Apple Pencil really good though? Buying a matte screen protector and a better nib so it doesn't feel like you're sliding a piece of plastic against glass, which, you know, I guess you are doing that. I have a love-hate relationship with the rock paper pencil product, a topic I'll cover in a future video. On the performance side, I do notice a speed difference from my 2018 model when opening apps, but it's most dramatic when working between two apps like Procreate and Procreate Dreams. That was pretty laggy before, now totally smooth. Stage Manager is also smoother, though I don't spend a ton of time there. Overall, it's pretty much of a somewhat better version of the still great 2018 iPad Pro. And that's the story with most technology these days. Almost everything we buy is kind of the same thing over and over. A little better, but better enough to warrant polluting the earth and spending a ton of money? For me, this time, yeah. And speaking of money, this thing was so expensive, about $2,500 with the keyboard and pencil, which is absurd. And part of this is Apple's upgrade path. They don't really advertise it, but you have to buy the 1 or 2 terabyte model to go from 8 to 16 gigabytes of RAM. And since RAM was a primary concern of mine, I had to get more storage than I'll ever use on an iPad just to get the RAM. This is something Apple is known for, charging way too much for what should be relatively inexpensive upgrades, and structuring their product line such that you always wind up spending more than you'd intended. Aside from cost, my biggest complaint is actually the size. The Samsung Galaxy Tab Ultra is a revelation. I used to work on a 24-inch Wacom screen, and the iPad's 13-inch screen is tiny by comparison. I'm sad to say that if Apple came out with a larger and more expensive iPad Pro, I'd almost certainly buy that one. Going from a 13-inch to a 16-inch screen would be amazing. So will you buy this iPad? What's your use case that makes the purchase worthwhile? Let me know. Soon, I'm going to be releasing a video about an animation I'm creating in Procreate Dreams, so follow along if that interests you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.